but I did a lot of social media stuff for PNHP and Students for National Health Program. Marcia, both my parents were Protestant ministers, Lutheran pastors, and so I ended up a pastor's kid twice over. Whether that segues into storytelling or passion for having, everyone having healthcare, there's maybe some through lines there. But so I have found it's helpful. So I'm a practicing physician in Connecticut, internal medicine, and I've found it's very helpful to have a little bit of a game to switch from medical stuff to more creative stuff. And I was hoping if this isn't too much of an ask, that we'll just do a quick writing exercise to kind of like get our brains firing into creating some stories in which we can use for advocacy and which we can use for convincing people that maybe our neighbors should also have healthcare and not have financial barriers to doing so. So I'm going to try and share my screen really quick, and let's see if this works. And we're going to go up here. And let's try that. How's that? Everyone can see screen. Does that look good? Perfect. All right. So we're going to start off with a warm-up, and the warm-up is called a 6-word memoir. Show of hands or nods. Has anyone done this before? Done this exercise? I'm seeing some shaking of heads. Great. So this is new. Perfect. So 6-word memoir is a writing exercise to a memoir is an anecdote about ourselves, a brief story, something that tells a larger, communicates a larger information about who you might be as an individual. And so if you haven't written a memoir before, tonight will be your first opportunity to write one. You can look at a few of the examples of kind of the theme. I like the one left for college, never came home, off to the left. To be honest, I like turtles. So these can be very quirky. They can be deep and meaningful, or they could be, what your favorite beverage or food is, but something that's going to shine a larger light on who you are. So to start, does everyone have a pen and paper? Okay. I would like you to just list off, doesn't have to be more than one sentence, an event in your life that caused you to be at this meeting tonight. Something that got you riled up, activated, excited to do this advocacy work. And just list an event, and then list maybe another event. Maybe it was talking with a colleague, maybe it was seeing a patient, maybe it was reading a headline, and just come up with a few different scenes from your life that were really important. And I'm going to go fast tonight to see if we can get through all this in an hour. So as you're writing those down, maybe once you have 2 or 3, just look up at your cameras, and then I can kind of tell to move on from there. I see a few glances. Even if you have just one scene, perfect. So now looking at those scenes, I would like you to come up with a list of emotions. What were you feeling during those events? Were you excited? Were you full of indignation? Were you tired? What were the feelings that came up with that situation?
Are we just yelling it out or raising hands?
Just writing it down for right now.
I'm sorry, man.
No, this is perfect. Thanks for the question. Okay, so hopefully you've got a few emotions down. Now we're gonna kind of go, just kind of close your eyes, put yourself in that scene. Again, this isn't polished, perfect stuff. This is just getting stuff on paper to kind of get things turning. What did you see? What was in that room? Who was with you? Just start listing off anything that pops up in that scene as you were feeling these emotions, as you were in this meaningful event. Um, this might be a clinic room and the walls are white and there's a stethoscope on the table and there's a computer in the corner. There's no wrong answers. Or it might be at, maybe it was a union meeting and there was someone behind a podium. Just no wrong answers. Just what was in that room, that scene with you? What was the stuff? And you're doing great. Okay, the next one are senses. So what did you smell? What did you hear? What did you touch? Any of the kind of the five senses other than sight, since we already got that one down, but kind of what else were you sensing? Did you hear anything? Was it quiet? Was it loud? Did it smell stale in that room? Was it musty, or was there lilacs blooming outside? What was the smell like? Okay, now that we've gotten some stuff on paper, and I know I'm going fast, and sorry if this is a little it feels a little uncomfortable, or we're kind of hitting the ground running. But now's the fun part, because now we kind of get to like, all right, all that stuff that we put on paper. Let's try and form some brief sentences, but it can't be longer than 6 words. You got 6 words to work with. And thinking back to the initial prompt of what were some of the reasons that brought you to this meeting tonight? What would 6 words together communicate? Can't do 7, sorry, and you can't do 5. And we'll put if any of you have a background in copy editing or grammar, we're going to put that, on the shelf. We're not going to worry about verb and noun agreements, that's okay, but just 6 words. And I'll give you some time to think about this. So it'll take, a good 2 or 3 minutes and see what comes together for you. Again, no wrong answers here. And as you're still writing here, I will say the one on the right is crazy, cooked, tapped, insane, psychotic, positively or passionately. That doesn't necessarily make sense when you read it through, but if it's just words that are popping up, I'm realizing the text on these post-it notes are a little small to read. But if it ends up just being 6 words and they're each their own sentence, that's fine too. Whatever you have is great. And you can always return to it and edit and make a new 6-word memoir. Maybe ask if anyone's brave enough to share. But first, how was that? Was that totally uncomfortable? Was that really easy? How did that go for folks just getting stuff down on page?
Pretty easy.
Great.
Good.
Mhm.
Ellen's nodding.
Well, it's a very good exercise to try and distill everything down to the essence of what you really want or feel or need.
Sure. Wonderful.
I'm surprised with what I came up with.
You're surprised. Well, Mike, does that mean you're going to be the first to share?
I'd be happy to.
Okay.
Do you want the screen share on, or
Why don't we just read them out to each other? Yeah, if I'll keep, if it's okay, I'll keep the screen share on.
okay?
Yeah.
Feel sad and guilty. It's unfair.
Yeah. That's got some cadence to it. Thanks for sharing. Maybe we can go around and share a few of them, and then we can kind of back up and maybe reflect on what some of the scenes were that we were envisioning as we were coming up with this. Can you say it one more time, Mike?
Feel sad and guilty. It's unfair.
Great.
As
Anyone
long
else?
as we're on a down note. I mean, I have an up one and a down one, so I guess I'll give both. One
Yeah.
was trapped, frustrated about the future, advocate. That's the happy one. And the other was trapped, frustrated about the future, defeated. So pick which one works better for you.
Right. Yeah, you can oscillate between those two depending on how you're feeling when you wake up in the morning. Thanks for sharing, Michelle. Maybe do one more if anyone feels so moved.
I can go.
Thanks, Andy.
This picture is all wrong. Change needed. And I had one more. We are all worthy of complete health.
I like that. Those are great. Can you say the first one again?
This picture is all wrong. Change needed.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great. Those are great. Thanks for sharing. So this was how are we doing on time? We're about 8:26. Okay. I think we're gonna keep plugging away. But it's worth mentioning of like, as we were kind of thinking about those initial scenes and some of the details that went in those scenes, in a lot of ways is how we communicate values and what's important to us. Marcia, I feel like kindred spirits over here of like, you hearing stuff from the pulpit and that being a value. When, that is one form of communication. And as we talk about advocacy, the things that happen in our lives, the things that happen in our neighbors' lives, the things that are most impactful, often inform the speech and the communication which we talk to other people when we're passionate about a given issue. Before we move on, I'd be curious if, so Marcia, you mentioned from the pulpit, it's worth just spending a brief moment thinking about, are there other points in our lives where you've seen someone speak and they've been very effective at it? So a religious gathering might be one example, but feel free to just shout it out. Where were you in a situation where you felt like whoever was speaking was really effective and you were engaged and you were listening intently? And I guess why? Where were you and why? saw Michelle unmute.
Yeah, and stuff. I had something in my brain and it went away. I mean, I think for me, since we're talking about healthcare and stories about healthcare, um, my friend who got me involved with Healthcare for All talked about how she got involved with Healthcare for All, which is that she needed blood, a bone marrow transfusion from her twin sister because she had a rare form of cancer, and the insurance company said it was too expensive, so they wouldn't approve it. And that is how she started getting involved. But I had not known that about her.
Yeah.
She had that at a, sort of like we were having a board meeting and just sort of sharing. And this was like the anniversary of her getting surgery. So that's why she was telling the story.
Wow.
So
And so that was your friend or your friend's sister?
my friend and stuff, but her twin
Yeah.
sister offered to give her the bone marrow,
Got
and the
it.
insurance
Got it.
company said too expensive. So eventually she did get it.
So that's a really good example, Michelle. What and if I can kind of ask you a follow-up question, what about that story was impactful to you?
Okay. To me, I guess what was impactful is the fact that, obviously shows the greediness and terribleness of insurance. Um, but also obviously that I have a relationship with her that's both a professional relationship because we're in social justice circles together and also a friendship.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's something a lot of people can relate to. I have to admit that a lot of the social justice things I'm more in because I really care about the issue. It's not really, for the most part, something that someone tells me. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, now I care about whales. So I don't know. You know what I'm trying to say? So I
Yeah.
was in to begin with, but that story sort of, I think also coming out of the blue and stuff is something I didn't know about her,
Yeah.
really impacted me on a personal level, that she's been personally touched by this.
Yeah.
And because of this large entity and stuff who didn't know her, who didn't know her situation, she might have died.
Yeah.
Unless she found a doctor who could passionately write something, and I guess they relented. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, thanks for letting me put you on the spot there, Michelle. That's so I was hearing you first said there was a villain, the insurance company, which always is a good component to a story. And just kind of like related to that, there was some stakes and some conflict where there was someone close to you that was hurting. And those stakes and that conflict, at least in that situation, could have been life and death, that there was a treatment that was needed, and then there was a barrier to that treatment. Just kind of pulling some of those and summarizing from what you said, that's a great example. I'm curious, anyone else have another example of a story or a speaker, or you've received some sort of communication from someone? Who was that someone and why was that story effective?
I can tell a brief story. I
Sure.
was in a department store and I went up to the cashier. I was going to buy a cap for my sister, and I had my Healthcare for All button on. And this young woman asked me what it was about, and I told her we're trying to get healthcare for everybody. And she started crying, and she said her friend's mother had died recently because she had cancer and they didn't have good insurance. And so the mother just stopped eating. And because she didn't want to hurt the family and she didn't want to have them spend a lot of money that could have been used for the child's education and other things. And so she said that had recently happened to her.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And what a story to just hear from a stranger just because you had a button on your shirt. Imagine,
Yeah.
you might have not even heard that story had you not been wearing that button. Yeah. So again, like, I will say sometimes analyzing stories can feel a little bit uh what's the word, a little bit sterile, you know, as we're kind of using these stories of kind of picking them apart, and I recognize that, you know, sometimes we talk about stories in healthcare and they're like deeply personable, because we're talking about our health, and what's more personal than our health. So as we're going through, I hope we aren't going too fast and we're not kind of, you know, not giving those stories the respect that they deserve. But for the purposes of this, I think, you know, it's helpful to kind of identify of like why certain stories are powerful. Because when it, you know, comes to that story that you mentioned, Alan, like one way to use and reflect on a story is like how it moves other people to action. You know, hearing about someone who didn't want to eat or didn't want to pursue treatment for fear of being a burden on their loved ones, that's incredibly hard and powerful and devastating. And when I think back to some of the 6-word memoirs that were mentioned, a lot involved around change, and it's like that makes me want to change something so that that doesn't happen. Thinking ahead a few minutes, I hope when we leave our time together in the next half hour that you will have at least a bullet point to think about your personal stories of how they can be used as a tool in advocacy. So that's where we're going. Where we are right now might look a little bit more like something you see at the movies or Hollywood. But I think it's worth spending a little bit of time of thinking about stories before we use those stories for advocacy. Looking here, has anyone seen this figure, the Freytag pyramid, before? This is kind of a classic model for stories. This is not the only model for stories. You know, if you ever YouTube Kurt Vonnegut talking about stories, he has kind of a hilarious whiteboard talk of different, you know, novels and literature, and he's on a chalkboard of going like, you know, up and down and up and down, and it's more of a roller coaster than just one mountain oftentimes in stories. But if you think to your favorite novel or your favorite movie, you can probably plot some points along this pyramid. So in the examples that were mentioned, let's say, let's talk insurance companies, since we're talking about healthcare. Let's talk about people without insurance, and let's talk about sickness and illness. What might be an inciting incident in American healthcare? Carolyn?
Refusal to pay.
A refusal to pay. So an insurance company refuses to pay. Yeah, that's a pretty good inciting incident. Thank you. Any other ideas? An inciting incident?
Pre-authorization.
A pre-authorization. I spent 45 minutes doing those today. That was an inciting incident. That was annoying. Any other thoughts? Those are both great.
I mean, it could just be a diagnosis.
I heard too. I heard a diagnosis. Absolutely. You know, out of the blue, whatever that diagnosis is, that's shocking and surprising. Did someone say something about expenses?
Yes, hidden expenses.
Hidden expenses. A medical bill that arrives in the mail that you were not expecting.
Yes.
Those are all inciting incidences. You know, if you were to apply this to say, have folks seen Lion King? You know, Disney movie. You know, the inciting incident in Lion King, spoiler alert, might be the death of Mufasa. Like that's not even the climax. That's like early in the movie. Like that is a terrible thing that happens early. So some stories, not all stories, have an inciting incident. So after those examples that were mentioned, what might be the rising action? And rising action is stakes. You know, what's at stake? What is what's building pressure behind that incident? A diagnosis is received. A medical bill comes in the mail. What happens right after that?
Worry.
Yeah, so much worry in any of those. So could be like building angst around the medical bill or the diagnosis. Absolutely. What's that kind of going into? What's the complication of that worry? Like what's underneath that worry, Ellen? What are the questions that are popping up?
Yeah, will somebody be able to keep their job and their income? How will it impact the family?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so we're on the first side of the mountain. Now, I will kind of go through the second side of this very quickly because we aren't necessarily creating stories based off of this. But the climax could be, and the complication, lots of organizing around single pairs pass, climax, and then everybody's happy on the back end. And that story probably has some problems and is probably too brief. But I think the purpose of this is, as we are talking about advocacy stories, it is important to identify kind of what are the stakes? Why does this matter? And we're going to transition from a story that sits alone. We will read a story and there will be some impact on us. We might look at the world a little bit differently. I'm certainly looking at the world a little bit differently, hearing your 6-word memoirs and hearing some of the stories that you've heard around healthcare. But if we are to use stories as a tool in advocacy, there's a little bit more intention behind it. And so one of the frameworks that we kind of went through this a little bit. I was going to do this in American healthcare, but I think we covered the basics. One of the frameworks that a lot of people have used, and I'd be curious, just show of hands, either again nodding or shaking your head, if you've seen this framework before. It comes out of some Marshall Gann's curriculum, who was an organizer in the South, has used this framework and has taught this a lot as a tool to what's called a public narrative. And the difference between a public narrative and a story is that there is structure to this story such that there is an intention to move people from point A to point B. So say you are talking to someone who has never heard of single payer or has never heard of prior authorizations, or maybe isn't from the United States, and you're in an educational mode to explain to them why this matters. And you want to move them from point A, maybe not knowing about universal healthcare as an option, to point B, to either being educated or activated or someone who can join you in your organizing work. So show it nod. I maybe saw one nod and a few head shakes. Has anyone seen this structure before or had someone else? Marcia?
Yeah, it's a good one, and I was interested in your talk today because I had taken that course, not course, a couple of sessions of doing that.
Amazing.
A couple of hours spent on developing your own story and then talking about it and moving along.
Wonderful. Well, I hope this isn't too redundant for you. Anyone else? I found doing this multiple times, actually, the public narratives that we develop get better and better the more practice we have, because this comes with a lot of practice. Anyone else familiar with this public narrative framework? And if not, then I'll kind of just go into it. Okay, great. If I'm quizzing too much and too many questions, just let me know. But I'd be curious, of the stories that we've talked about so far tonight, if any of these 3 components have come up. The story of, we're going to go through each one individually, but the story of self, who you are as a person, the story of us, what shared values and experiences that are represented in the stories, and the story of now, which is kind of a call to action or the pressing issue. In the stories that we've told tonight, which one have you seen some of these pop up? Have you seen stories of self or stories of now? I'm realizing maybe I should ask this after we go through each one. I may be getting ahead of myself. Let's go through each one. I think I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So we can kind of like dissect each one, and then we'll come back as groups. So story of self. I would say this has come up a few times tonight, especially with our 6-word memoirs that we've identified some shared or some kind of core values of what brought us here. So a story of self is kind of it's a little bit of a autobiography. It's information about yourself. Why were you called to motivate others? So why is this personal to you? And what, if you were to meet someone on an elevator and you were talking about universal healthcare, which can be very jargony, it can be a lot of policy discussions really quick. Like, what would be the story that you would tell that others would get you? And I would say, like, some of those stories were told tonight of you met someone in a grocery store that told an impactful story to you about someone who didn't have easy access to healthcare. So I would like us just to sit with this a little bit. And if you were to tell a stranger why this issue and single payer and universal healthcare is important to you, where would you start? And so if you have your pen, if you have like a new little page, you can kind of rip off the 6-word memoir. And just spend a few moments writing down like what values are important to you and why does this like impact you? It is great to tell a story about someone you met. It is great to tell a story about a sister who did not have health care. But this is where we need to use I and me language, because there's actually research that looks at when you tell a story, the further degrees of separation you are from that story, you're a little bit less effective. So if you're telling a story about a cousin's brother-in-law's daughter who had an issue with getting a life-saving medication, that's a powerful story. But it's a lot more powerful if it was you. Now, not all of us have that story, and that's okay. But there needs to be I and me statements when we're talking about a story of self. And so let's just spend a minute or two thinking about that as like, why, what has happened in your life using I and me statements? Why are you here? At least provide a framework to get us moving. Marcia, the full workshops, as you mentioned, can take a few hours because we're going to go through this and then, we can practice and give people feedback. So tonight is definitely an abbreviated version, but at least to kind of get us a foundation to move from. So how did that go for folks? Was that hard? Yeah.
If I understand, I really like the point that you can have a good story about someone else, but when you're telling that story, if you relate it to yourself, then you're closer to the story, and then they'll relate to it better. So is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in this case, I heard somebody else's story and I thought, I haven't had that problem because I've had good insurance.
Right.
And I know how much I appreciated it. And what if I hadn't in that case?
Yeah. And this isn't to say, as we talk about health inequities and placing financial interests of large health insurance companies and device companies and hospitals and money making institutions before people. That is not to say like that story that you were told, Ellen, and sharing it here is not without value. I mean, like that was an impactful story that you told tonight. I think the piece is recognizing that there's a difference between when we are talking about someone else and when we are talking about ourselves, because it's just a little bit, it's a little bit more of a connection when we're not referencing anyone else. So, but you
Does it
kind of,
matter?
oh, go ahead, Michelle.
Does it matter who we're talking to when we're telling this story? So, like, does it matter if the person is more aligned with us versus not, or whether we're talking at a Rotary Club versus a conference versus
Yeah,
whatever?
it totally does. And I think we should loop back to that question when we've gone through the other two sections, Michelle, because that's really important. Because when we, I think that the piece that will be tailored more is the story of now, is the call to action or what you're trying to move someone towards. Because if someone's very aligned with you, you might try and move them towards something very different than someone that's maybe more of a reach that, you know, you're kind of going in and you're not sure if this person is going to hear you or not. You might be directing or trying to align with them differently than someone who's an obvious supporter. So it's a great question. Let's revisit it in a little bit. And Mary Beth, I see.
Yeah, so sorry I got knocked off, so you might be ahead of me now. But I do think one of the things that's difficult about a story of self is that many people do have a challenge speaking about themselves, right? And talking about themselves. So I don't know if anyone mentioned that because I knocked myself out somehow.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. I grew up in the Midwest my entire life, lived in rural Wisconsin and then rural Minnesota for a while. And if there's any cultural norm of those areas of the Midwest, is thou shalt not talk about thyself. Much better to gossip about others. Yeah, totally. And for this purposes, it would encourage us all to get over that a little bit. But it's totally valid, and I totally hear you. But to that piece of like when we do dive down deep for stories of self, Laura brought up, it's an emotional experience, and that takes some time to sit with. That maybe take some reflection of figuring out like what are exactly the words that I want to use to explain why this is so crucially important to me, and that takes time and effort and planning. So, but thanks for bringing that up. Okay, we're good. Oh, yep, Sandy.
Yeah, Augie, I was just the story that has been in my mind the whole time that we have been going through this process has to do with me hearing a story from someone I know very well, like years, and then she told me this story, and then she did it publicly, and I had never heard it from her before. So I'm sitting in the audience, and she's telling me why her husband died, and it was, one of these stories of being underinsured and going into a mortgage and having to mortgage her, and she was in her 60s. And anyway, that's not about me, but that's the story that really pushed me into working on healthcare.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's incredibly powerful. And I think sometimes like it is a common refrain that is said that I knew someone that had terrible insurance, and I knew someone that that was incredibly close to me, have a terrible healthcare experience. And yet I was lucky and fortunate and privileged to have not had that situation. And sometimes that is the story. And I would say, how are you like that person in that situation? If an example would be, maybe you've just had your 65th birthday and you've gone on Medicare, and that's been a relief. And you can share that relief with the person in that story of like, that was the relief that should have been in that story, but it wasn't. And so I think it's there's not a right, not a right way. We're all close to stories that are impactful. I think it brief side note, we never want to tell a story that is someone else's and claim it for ourselves. I will just kind of sit with that for a little bit. We should never be, dealing the details of saying that, this is because this person experienced this, I too have experienced that. That is not what we're aiming for. Which I think kind of dovetails into this story of us. And I think hopefully this will help kind of smooth around the edges. But it's great, we've probably all been in that situation, as I may be doing now, listening to someone talk about themselves and keep talking about themselves and keep talking about themselves more and more and more. And you start wondering where the nearest exit is and what's your excuse for getting out of this conversation because this person is continuing to talk about themselves. That is not a helpful story of self, and not something that's helpful in advocacy, because we need to create a connection with who's ever listening to us. And that comes a little bit in this idea of story of us. And who was asking, maybe Michelle was asking about, do I tailor this at all to who I'm talking to? Is like, how do you, back this way, how do you create a shared value? So in the stories we've been telling tonight, the shared values that I've heard is security. We all want security. I've heard we all want healthy, happy lives. I've heard we all want support in times that are precarious. That explains health and healthcare pretty darn well. What is the shared value that if you said this out loud, not even the most partisan person could disagree with you? Like, this is the most obvious, welcoming shared value statement, but how does it relate to your story of self and universal healthcare and single payer? So, what values, what experiences, what do you share with your community? In this case, those here on the Zoom tonight, that would appeal to them. What is a value that if you said, hey, I think we share this, that we have this in common, what would that look like? And so let's just take a brief moment and think about, some of those values that would shape a story of us as you're talking with people. And we'll be really quick. We're coming up on 9, and I promised I'd be done in an hour. So spend a couple minutes.
Mary Beth has her hand up.
Yeah, Mary Beth. Or maybe it's lingering.
No, it's not a hanging hand, as it were. No, I actually recently had this experience with a Republican lawmaker who serves on the House Healthcare Committee, and there's been here in Oregon, and there's been a lot of work in this last few months in the legislature around corporate practice of medicine. And so I don't know this guy. I've never met him. I'm pretty certain he voted for the bill at this point, but I wasn't sure, right? So I was like, okay, I want to be careful with my language because I don't know where he stands. And so I went up and he said, introduce myself, blah, blah, blah. And then he's like, yeah, well, I'm not a single payer advocate, right? And I was like, wow, I mean, I think that we can probably all agree that, corporations having control over doctors, you know, and patient care, being in the middle there with private equity firms, is pretty outrageous. And he was like, oh yeah, you know, I was really happy that, you know, and so you know, it's just around finding that piece of agreement, right? And sometimes it may not even be on healthcare, right? But I think it goes to that, the value statements, but also finding common ground so that then the listener or the person you're approaching is more open to what you're saying, because they already have a preconceived notion of you as a single payer advocate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great point, and always looking for opportunities of like, it's really hard to do it when people say just silly, asinine things in public and trying to find a shared value. But honestly, that's what advocacy and organizing is assuming that, you know, anyone I talk to might be an ally. And that's really hard. And requires equanimity and patience. And so yeah, bravo for bringing that up, and for your experience. Thanks for sharing. I will add the story of us of like a shared value. This is really easy in medicine because, you know, you could even go down to, you know, if you've had healthcare issues, well, we all share the anatomy of having a heart. And, you know, if the story involves someone having, you know, a heart that was a heart attack, or a heart that's maybe not pumping as well, and that's the medical issue going on, and you throw into that you've had insurance issues and don't have access to good healthy heart care, the easy shared value is you too have a heart and you too might run into this situation just like me. That's maybe a cheesy example, but hopefully a few of these, as you're thinking of shared values, and as you're thinking about these stories, you know, how might I offer a lifeline to a shared experience with the person who's listening to me? Caroline.
Yeah, I thought I'd ask if you have insight on something that in sort of red territory I get a shocking amount, it seems to me, is that this sort of obsession with not wanting people who don't deserve it to get health care. And I really am not sure how to counter that. I just don't know how you counter that is somebody that doesn't deserve to have health care.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard one. And trying to find like some shared, you know, and I will say there's I've been in a few workshops where one of the games that activists and organizers play is you're in a room full of people and you're given a prompt of whether you're very hard to convince or very easy to convince, but you can't tell who got the cards that are very easy to convince and very hard to convince. And at the end of the day, this isn't to say we're all eating at the same lunch table and going to be able to bring everybody into the movement and everyone be excited about things. I think it's hard where, you know, I like to think that maybe we're all a little bit stressed and uncertain about healthcare in this country, such that we've been conditioned to think that it's a limited resource and I need to hoard some for myself. And that's maybe through the fault of no one other than the system that we've created, such that I need to be a little bit protective of myself to make sure that there's enough healthcare for me and my family. You know, I think there's this sense of, for whatever for not a good reason, that expanding healthcare to other people will somehow take away from what I perceive to be limited access already. Maybe there's an opportunity there for a shared concern. I don't know. But that's a really tough and important question.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm gonna cruise. Thanks for bearing with me and the speed of this, and the questions have all been amazing to move us forward. So what good is a story about yourself? And what good is a story if you've just created some shared values? Like that's wonderful. But the icing on the cake would be, can that story move people? Is there some acceleration to the engine that you've built in your story? You've told personal details that are critically important to you, and convey a message about your values that you share with the person who's listening. But now you kind of need to move that person, and why is this important now? So the story of now that has been brought up previously in some of the conversations, or some of the stories that were told tonight, of like, well, if someone's faced with a new diagnosis, like if that diagnosis is serious, there's some urgency to treatment. That's a story of now. There needs to be action and connecting with health professionals that can appropriately address whatever diagnosis that was. So again, take maybe a quick minute or two, but like, what is the of the story of self and the shared values as you're thinking about those important situations that have happened in your life that brought you here tonight? Why is it urgent? Why not wait until 2027? Why is this? And what does success look like? So if you were on a campaign, maybe that's passing a state-based single payer legislation. Is that the successful action that you need support on? Because this is essentially kind of a little bit of, at the end of this, you'll do the sales pitch of like, what do you need? So there's an urgency to your story, but what is the ask of the person now? Is this, show up to our meeting next Tuesday? Is this sign this petition? Is this go to a day on the Hill and meet with the legislator? Whatever that looks like, there will be an ask of the listener. Again, I think to Michelle's point, tailoring that ask, if this is someone that you think is on your side or someone that's closer to you, because you want to move them from that point A to point B. So I'm blabbing a little bit, but take a minute here. Why is this important now? And what is success? So I hope that wasn't too terrible. Was there one component that was more challenging than others? The story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And then we'll talk a little bit of like how these are combined and used together. But I'm curious if there was some areas that were relatively smooth, or some that are maybe a little bit more
Well,
hairy.
the story of now for me is a little less in the feels and stuff. So I don't know that, but that maybe that will appeal to people because,
Yeah.
for myself, there's a personal part that appeals to me. Social justice, yay. So like when we were supposed to write down, I was like, we have to do it now because this is a huge undertaking and we need to change over a whole system and we need to find jobs for people who honestly might lose their jobs when we have single payer health care. That's okay because we're going to get them new jobs. And so we can't wait. We have to do it now. So because it's a lot of work. So we got to start now. So that's a little less in the feels and stuff, but it is a huge undertaking, and that is why we have to do it now. So I don't know how appealing that might be to people, but it might appeal to somebody.
I think that's an astute point of, some of these components are emotional. They, full of the feels, and that is important. When you hear a good story or public narrative, it should evoke some emotion in the listener. In order to do that, a lot of that is the story of self. And you're right, the story of now is a little bit more, a little bit urgent, less feels, more specific, maybe a little bit more in your face of just like, hey, there's a crisis going on, no time for feels, time for action. So I think they kind of have complementary components, as you were alluding to.
I'm a Bostonian, so in your face is in my DNA. But I think for me, the story of self is always more difficult because I don't like talking about myself, right? Because it's not about me; it's about everybody else, in my opinion, right? So there's that, and I think for Oregonians, and I really don't know what Mike, and there might be other Oregonians on the phone too, but we have a real opportunity here, and I think there's a lot of states where we're on the cusp, and I think that with the not only kind of the even with the advances of coverage, right? Because many states, particularly in the West, but Massachusetts, Connecticut, others have done a great job covering people, but we still have these inequities, whether that's, but you're still covered, can't get your care, the surprise billing, these facilities fees, which is the new thing coming up, right? With, one more way to price gouge patients, right? But Oregon really is on the cusp of creating a simplified, equitable, and affordable healthcare system. And so that, for me, with the story of now, because it is urgent and happening right now, but also with the fact that, the cost of healthcare is unsustainable for patients, for providers, for businesses, and certainly for taxpayers. And I think that is a helpful and galvanizing kind of statement when, Oregon's spending on healthcare has increased 40% in the last 8 years. Unsustainable, right? You have to do something. And you may think it's a wackadoodle socialist idea, but we've tried these other ideas and look where we are.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Mary Beth. As you were talking there, I was kind of pulling a few sentences out of what you were talking about that were really effective to me, of when you mentioned how much Oregon was wasting on healthcare. Some of the sprinkling in some of those data points are really important, especially with the story of now, because those all support this idea of urgency. Similar to it being really easy to zone out when someone's only talking about themselves, it's also similarly easy to zone out when someone's only sending statistics your way, and it's just hard to keep track of all the zeros and numbers. But as you brought up, a few of those, a little bit of salt and pepper on the food, goes a long way in kind of wrapping things up and telling the urgent story of why this is important and why action is needed ASAP. So, okay. So usually at this part of the workshop, we look at an example of someone doing a public narrative and then kind of dissect that. That's the and then we move on to practice our own and give feedback. So this is kind of maybe there's a part 2 of this workshop. So that's about an hour long. I'll maybe conclude there. I can send out a link to Mike of an example of this being used, and would say, as you're listening to it, kind of log what is effective about the story of self, what is effective about the story of us, and what is effective about the story of now. I think it can be a little bit hard to kind of conceptualize this without seeing an example of it being done, and it being done well. So I can do that. I can also give a brief example of what I've used, but I also want to just pause here and gauge the temperature, and if people are ready to scoot out, that's reasonable. or if there's questions about what we've talked about so far.
I'd be eager to see that, Augie, and the slide set. Are you willing to share those?
Sure. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I can send those out after we get
very open to hanging out if that's the majority opinion.
I personally need to leave in about 5 minutes, but obviously other people, everyone do what's best for them.
Well, maybe Mike, I'll send you the link, or I can post the link in the chat right now. Why don't I do that? I'm gonna stop screen sharing. And there we go. Are we back together? Great. And I'll post the link in the chat. I will say a content warning for the video. There are references to suicide. It's a video that was released around the It Gets Better campaign, when there was an increase of suicides among LGBTQ youth. And so that was the advocacy and the issue going on. So it's heavy. It's a heavy story, but just want to make folks aware of that if you end up watching it. It's also a very good example of the story of self, us, and now, and how that can be used. This is one venue. Not everybody's going to have a megaphone and be at a rally and have that platform. But I think is a good example of how effective a structured public narrative can be. So really lovely to spend time with y'all tonight.
Thanks so much, Augie, for